Welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. We're happy that you're joining us today. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan. Matt, welcome to
Hello.
you. What a team we have here on the Catholic Buzz. It's like sometimes I think maybe one day it's like a surprise will be and you won't be here and someone else will, but it never happens.
Never. I'm always here.
You're always here.
I'm always here.
Yeah. And today we have something that has come up in the news recently that people ask a lot about it. So we're going to talk about it. And it's kind of, something that I think about that it brings a lot of pain to people because we're going to be talking about what happens when a priest is no longer a priest.
Yeah.
And me as a priest, I know that the influence priests have on their people, for better or worse.
Yeah.
And priests who are faithful, you see the great influence they have and the building up of community or the spiritual lives of people, right? And then priests who aren't faithful, even who I'm talking about priests who remain in the priesthood and have lost the joy of the priesthood, sometimes just by their attitude or things they say, sort of are a drag to their parishioners, right? And there's no livelihood, you don't sense joy, you don't sense life there. Then there's another type of scandal that I think is priests who leave the priesthood. And I think right away, priests who leave the priesthood is a scandal, one way or another.
Yeah, interesting.
And however, in that scandal, that there can be some okay things that happen and some further terrible things that happen. Like a priest who leaves the priesthood gracefully, if you can, and lives a faithful life as a Catholic, as someone who lives what other Christians are expected to live, and then there are priests who leave the priesthood and live a totally opposite life.
Yeah, from what the pendulum swung to the other way.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and it kind of pains me a little bit because I know the influence that priests have on people, but I also understand the major responsibility that priests hold, right? And sometimes people can't handle that. Yeah. So it's a sensitive issue, but I think more so what people are interested, they don't care what I think, but they care about the questions that people have are real. What happens when a priest is no longer a priest? Like, can that happen?
Yeah.
What does it take for that to happen? What does it mean? Like, so what? He's not just a priest. He's free to do whatever now, or... Yeah.
I think that's a great. A lot of people don't realize, because if we compare the priest to, let's say, the another Christian denomination of some sorts,
right?
A pastor goes to school, gets their papers, and then can be a pastor, but then they can just stop being a pastor, right? It's not one of those things that it's a job. It's a vocation, but it's a job, and then they can stop being a pastor and then become just a regular person in the congregation. Yeah,
that's a good difference to make. Like, pastors are usually hired for specific jobs or roles for a specific period of time or a contract length, whereas Catholic priests
are it's a vocation, so they're ordained into priesthood, and so it's a different thing when you're ordained by God. It's a sacrament that you take. So I guess the big question here becomes, so what happens when a priest who can hear confession, because they're in persona Christi, they can hear confession, they can perform but God through them performs transubstantiation in the Eucharist, and they can say the Mass, and then they confession and like all perform the sacrament of sick, or even in some cases, if the bishop gives them permission, they can confirm people and those kind of things. So like once you're ordained into this life and you have these gifts available to you, then what happens when you come away? Because people leave for two different reasons, right? Sometimes it's because of a punishment of some sorts, or because they've done something stupid, or because of whatever, and they've been taken away. And we see about that in the news right now. There's some people that are there, for abuse scandals and those types of things, or just other reasons. They're being laicized, or their clerical state is being revoked. No, what's that called?
Loss of clerical state.
Loss of clerical state. That's what it's called. And so you have priests, and then you also have priests that are leave the priesthood later because they've discerned that they aren't called towards the priesthood. And what you said, like, it's a tragic either way. One of the things, though, is it's unfortunate that those people couldn't have discerned in the 6, 7, 8 years. And I don't necessarily. I mean, hopefully, it's not. Again, not to judge or hold anybody up, but like part of that might be their spiritual director, whoever that is. It's like there's a whole bunch of people that failed along the way there to maybe to figure that out. And maybe it's pressure, maybe it's this, that, and the other thing, right? Like there's a bunch of reasons, but those two things both happen. A priest is laicized. Now what happens? They can no longer hear confessions. They can no longer be in persona Christi at Mass. They can never, all those kinds of things. So what happens there? Like how does that actually take place?
Well,
how do we deconsecrate a priest?
Like you mentioned that, the priest receives his priesthood through a sacrament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The sacrament of holy orders. Mm-hmm. And this is a sacrament that cannot be undone. Just like the sacrament of baptism.
Yeah.
Okay, so the sacrament of baptism leaves what's called an indelible mark on the soul.
Gotcha.
Once someone is baptized, they cannot be unbaptized. Like I know there's been cases where people like sue churches to revoke their baptism. Now, someone can verbally say, I'm revoking my faith in the Catholic Church, and that can be recorded or something, but you can't reverse your baptism. Like once you're baptized, it's a mark on your soul. Well, once you're ordained, once you've received the holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders, that can't be undone. Like you are a priest forever.
So once you're a priest, you're a priest forever.
You're a priest forever. And I think that is difficult for people to understand when a priest has done terrible things. Like let's look back to the sexual abuse cases. Right, where that blew up and caused a lot of pain for people and shone this light in this very dark place of the church. And the church was criticized for a number of things, but one of the things that the church was criticized for was that these priests were still priests, right? That they weren't not priests anymore. And here's where we get into the loss of clerical state, where you can't just remove the priesthood from someone. You can remove the connection to the clerical state, right? So there's suspensions that happen.
Okay, so tell me the levels here. So there's suspension. What's the suspension?
Well, first, maybe to be more clear, even though you're ordained a priest, you still need faculties from your local ordinary, which is your local bishop, to serve as a priest.
So they grant you the permission to serve
in
as a priest.
this territory, which we call dioceses, or areas where religious communities serve. Yeah. So the superior of that religious community or the local ordinary, the local bishop, gives faculties, gives permissions for a priest to act as a priest.
And so that's one of the bishop's roles in his diocese is to be able to grant those permissions or remove them, to investigate or remove them if he feels necessary.
That's right.
Okay.
And so, for example, if me, who's ordained a priest for my diocese, I have faculties from my bishop to be a priest here in my diocese. But the second I go to the neighboring diocese, where I'm not a priest of that diocese, I need permission from their local bishop to celebrate Mass or to do any of the other side. Like, for example, some of my family lives in another diocese down south. So when I go there to celebrate baptisms and marriages and things like that, I need permission from the local ordinary, the local bishop, to be able to do that. So first is faculties. Any priest needs faculties from their bishop to serve as a priest. Those can be removed.
Yep.
Those can be removed from you for one reason or another.
Gotcha.
Or maybe not granted, I should say. Mm-hmm. Like if I went to another diocese
they'd say no.
They could say no because of something they're afraid I'm going to say, or maybe something they heard me say on this podcast, but whatever reason, it doesn't have to be granted.
Yeah.
Then there's suspension. You could be suspended as a priest. And those usually come with pretty specific instructions from the bishop.
Yeah.
Okay. And that could be that you are only allowed to celebrate Mass by yourself in your home.
Padre Pio was, in a way, he was suspended in his faculty. Like he was suspended from public life for a while. There,
he was limited in what he could do.
And so it wasn't suspended per se. Like he was still allowed to practice as a priest, but not to consult with the public.
That's right.
So I mean, again, I'm just using this as that's a positive image of how the church uses their authority to kind of let's put a handle on this situation and see what's going on.
Yeah.
Before we major decisions here, right?
That's
yeah,
right.
and there are perfectly legitimate scenarios where
Sure.
the faculties of a priest are either suspended or revoked. So
Yeah.
you can even imagine, a priest coming to close to retirement, but not quite there, developing something like dementia, or like developing something that prevents them from having the capacity to perform their priestly obligations.
That's right. Yeah. And so after that, so you could be suspended for one reason or other with certain restrictions. The case of laicization, or defrocked, is what media calls it. A priest is defrocked, or we call it laicized, or loss of clerical state. That is a whole different process. We've heard it in the news. Father Frank Pavone from Priests for Life in the United States was laicized. So now he's Mr. Frank Pavone.
Not Father.
Not Father Frank Pavone. And that's a whole topic for maybe another episode or whatever. But so what is the process? Well, there is a process. It's not just like the bishop wakes up one day, has a grudge against you and says, that's enough. There's a whole process. And I think you alluded to it a little bit before. Sometimes laicization is requested by the priest, and sometimes it's imposed on the priest for one reason or another. So let's look at those two areas, voluntary and involuntary, right? So voluntary would be the priest asking for laicization. So he's come to a point where he's like, boy, I can't do this anymore, or I don't feel like maybe this was the right call for me, or whatever it might be. And, sadly, some statistics show that there is a concern, at least, within the church, that some priests are more likely to leave the priesthood within the first 5 years of ministry.
But that's kind of very similar if you think about it in the terms of vocation. Divorce rates and annulments rates happen in the first 5 years.
Right.
So if you can make it through the first 5 years, you're I can't remember exactly the percentages, but you're like less than half likely.
That's right.
Like half of all marriages end in the first 5 years. For one reason or another. And so if you can make it through the first 5 years, because that's the point where you've come over the hiccups and you've actually, you've taken your vow of through sickness and health in marriage, but also as a priest, I'd imagine, the same kind of thing in sickness and in health, and through the good times and the bad, seriously, and you've overcome that.
Yeah, I think that is a helpful way of thinking about it, even though it's not a perfect analogy. At one level, you can say that
As a
voluntary laicization is to the priesthood what annulment is to marriage. It's not divorce. It's not just like a hard break. That there's actually a process where you investigate, whether or not they have a legitimate or illegitimate reason for wanting to leave the priesthood, because there are legitimate situations where either the discernment process didn't take into account something like mental illness or addiction or whatever, like a lot of the questions that they would ask in an annulment process. But when a marriage is annulled, it's invalidated. So the initial marriage itself is invalidated. When a priest is laicized, this is why the analogy isn't perfect, that, once you're ordained a priest, you are a priest forever. But you can have serious questions about whether or not they should have become a priest in the first place. The process or the outcome of that can take multiple forms. The person can remain a priest, but have their faculties revoked if they're not in a state where they can, fulfill those obligations. Or in some cases where it may be most appropriate for them to be removed from the priesthood because, they were either tricked into it, or like the discernment process or whatever,
pressured or whatever.
Exactly. They shouldn't have been a priest in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe from being in the seminary and with other people, I think there's this expectation, this sort of dream. Everyone has this what the priesthood's gonna be like. And maybe that's just not something that's sets well for someone when they do become a priest. And sometimes I must say there's outside factors too. Like people aren't always kind to priests.
No, 100%.
And there are some thick-skinned priests, and there are ones that are a little more sensitive, that maybe can't handle the criticisms and the complaints we get and the difficulties there are. It's not all difficulties. I mean, we are in the person of Jesus, and Jesus also suffered some of the same things, right? So it kind of comes with the territory. Now, there are people who, also voluntary leave the priesthood by just going to get married. So they go get married, and that's an invalid marriage because they are not free to marry.
It's not like you just. It would be considered like if I just decide, okay, I'm going to leave my wife and then just marry somebody else.
Exactly.
That doesn't actually, But there are forms of laicization, right? That you can. There are three ones. One of them is if you break the vow of celibacy. No, not celibacy. Is it celibacy or is it marriage? I think it's. I can't remember which one specifically.
If you marry.
Yeah, if you marry, well, you're taking on another vocation while you already have a vocation.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So you are basically, even though you've done it voluntarily, like now the church will impose on you.
Here we're shifting gears from kind of a voluntary laicization process to initiating a canonical process where either your bishop or your bishop initiates a canonical process to have you removed from the priesthood.
And even with a voluntary laicization, there is a process. Like you have to speak to your bishop, you have to explain why, and usually before
discernment and stuff.
There's a discernment. They send you off on a retreat or a sabbatical of some sort. They try and get you help, maybe counseling, for whatever the issue might be.
But that would be very similar to an annulment scenario where if you have two people that are struggling in their marriage, you're going to send them for help first,
right?
Before you're like, oh, you guys don't like each other anymore? Okay, you're done. Right. You're going to try to get them actual help to work through.
And then the person petitioning for a laicization, asking for to be defrocked, they have to explain what the situations are and all those different things, right? And so there is a proper process of interrogation and investigation that takes place by the bishop, and then sends to the dicastery for the congregation of the faith.
For clergy
for clergy. And that's at the Vatican, and they sort of take care of these sort of cases.
Yes, because ordination can be done at the diocesan level, but laicization actually needs to come from
Rome, from Vatican. Yeah.
So a dispensation from the clerical state is granted by the Vatican only, like Matt said. Now that's voluntary. Involuntary would be a priest has committed a crime.
Yes.
And guilty. A priest is continually not living up to his priestly promises. Maybe he's causing trouble or dissent in the church. Maybe he's actively speaking or preaching or conducting himself in a manner that's not in line with the Catholic Church. And again, doesn't happen overnight. This would be something where the bishop is correcting him, having conversations with him, maybe even giving him a new appointment or scaling back his appointments, scaling back his faculties. Like all these different things could happen. And then there is a canonical process as well, where instead of you filling out sort of what your reasons for leaving the priesthood is, the bishop or his people sort of build the case and send it to the same dicastery at the Vatican. Now, some of these dispensations come quick. Like when we had an episode to remember Pope Benedict the 16th, we talked about how he quickly laicized hundreds of priests who were convicted of sexual abuse.
Yes, right away. Yeah,
and that seems to be what Pope Francis is also following. These cases of sexual abuse, they're
as soon as
pretty quickly. There are other reasons, like if someone was to go get married or whatever, the bishop puts that forward. And there are other numerous reasons
where it doesn't require a detailed investigation to actually to confirm that it meets the criteria for laicization. Like if there's any debate, because as part of the canonical process, like the priest has the opportunity to defend themselves.
It's almost like a trial, right?
It's very similar to like a civil court case.
Now on that too, I read somewhere, even going to a priest going into military service without permission from the bishop or the local, like that right there is automatic laicization as well. So taking on another type of vocation, as you kind of said, that might be contrary. And again, depends. It's not like we have priests that are in the military that are under a bishop that are like, so it's not just because of military, right? But if you decide just to like go AWOL, just to leave, just to kind of go do that, like,
if you decide to become the head of a political party.
Yes.
It's a very similar
Yeah.
thing. Although, and it's funny that we think about laicization sometimes in the same way we think about kind of excommunication, and because we were talking about like the different layers of like suspension or loss of faculties or removal from the clerical state to excommunication. We think that these are all kind of tied together, but there's actually a really complicated. We were talking even before the podcast. It's like when you're excommunicated, you are excommunicated by the act. But even if I'm a priest and I decide to become, the head of, this or that political party, I'm not automatically laicized. But
No.
I've created a condition that would definitely
Probably
initiate
warrant
that
or
process
initiate,
for me.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, now
That's a
question
good point.
question on that one then. Okay, so if a priest was to be excommunicated them by themselves, like meaning they self-excommunicated by performing an action of some sorts, they killed somebody or something.
They've revealed something from the confessional.
Okay,
Yeah.
reveal something from the confessional. They've done that, and then so they've excommunicated themselves, but the bishop doesn't necessarily know.
Yeah.
So now they've taken themselves outside of the grace of the church, outside of what the church's stance is on what this, that, or the other thing. But they perform mass. Is mass valid?
They would investigate that in hindsight. So there could be a number of illicit masses that people don't actually know are illicit. But when it comes to light that, this is what that priest did, this is when they did it, did they make reparation? Did they confess? Did they follow the appropriate steps to be brought back into proper communion? But if not, they would kind of investigate back to that point, identify which were the illicit sacraments, and try and make reparation.
Correct them.
In the same way that
The baptism.
yeah, we did
we
that.
talked
Found out that his priestly ordination was invalid.
Well, because he wasn't baptized in the first
yeah.
place, and so he wasn't able to be priestly. Oh, okay.
So they had to
he
do
would
an
go back.
investigation into the different types of sacraments as well, because you require different faculties and different.
Interesting. Yeah. That's
And this is another practical reason why priests have faculties to perform their priestly duties, because so the bishop has a list of active priests who are in good standing, because sometimes it has happened, and I've seen it happen, where people impersonate a priest.
Yeah.
And they celebrate sacraments with people that are obviously invalid and illicit.
Well,
right?
I've heard of cases before of people pretending to be priests or saying, "Oh, I'm okay." Like the church knows I'm doing this, and then goes to baptize, or goes like there's places like that, or even performing other sacraments, saying that this is like. There was a place I was looking at down south. Was it somewhere? And they have the word Catholic in it. But they're performing similar to the ritual of the Mass, but it wasn't the Mass. But they were performing
the old
like,
Catholic Church
like,
or something.
like, it was, I can't remember exactly what it's
Yeah.
called, but they were like doing that and calling themselves Catholic, but they're not. They're not. They don't have the faculties of Catholic Church. They're not. So it's really important that when you if you're worried about a person or someone that is being suggesting that they are a priest or something, just go ask your it's very easy. Go to a Catholic church that you know is active. Walk in there, talk to the priest.
Yeah.
Because the bishop ain't gonna let somebody work inside the church. That's
Yeah, and it might be a
priest.
concern, like, for example, when I go to visit a hospital or a nursing home or something that's outside of my parish, I have identification on, right? I have a badge with
Don't
my
you get
name.
little cards or something like that?
We do, we do have little cards that we could carry around. And so, maybe the Vatican needs to issue like a driver's license
For
type
priests.
ID for priests or something like that. Yeah. Okay, I do want to talk about what happens to a priest after they're laicized.
Yeah.
Like, what has happened? So now they're ordained a priest. And, I do have sympathy for some people who leave the priesthood, because I don't think that they thought their life would turn out this way. But let's say they've studied in the seminary. This is their livelihood. Now they're kind of a public figure. Now it's trying to sneak back into the, quiet, private life. It's not easy. Of course, and I'm talking about priests maybe who have voluntarily asked for laicization, not those who are, have committed criminal crimes and warrant the judicial system verdicts and all those things. So what happens to a priest? Now, there are certain restrictions that the Vatican leaves on priests who are laicized, because remember, you are a priest forever.
Yeah,
we can't reverse that. So even though a priest is dispensed from the clerical state and reduced, is what they say, to the lay state, there are still certain obligations connected with that new lifestyle that they're going to have because of the indelible mark that they have as a priest. So they have to make every effort to be living their life in the moral capacity that would warrant you being a former priest. And I do know priests who have left the priesthood and do that.
Live good holy lives.
Yeah.
And you'd call them a man of God.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I do know priests who have left the priesthood and
On the other way?
have gone the absolute other way. And this causes scandal.
Of course.
And that's one of the conditions that the Vatican gives, that you are not to provoke scandal in your new life. And some people, now, I don't know what's in their mind or in their hearts. Some people are angry when they leave the priesthood. They feel like they've been slighted or shorted or whatever it might be. And so it's kind of like, you're going against the grain, like you're so you're acting out sort of thing, and you're doing things that just aren't in line with someone who's been ordained a priest.
You could almost feel like you've gotten 7, 8, 9 years stolen from you because you were pressured into this, and it's not your fault ever. It's always somebody else's fault. Like, you know what I mean? So that's where I see the acting out would come in. But like, be like, okay, I was forced into this. I was pressured into this. But
Right.
you did have, you stood. I mean, some people could say that about marriage, the same kind of thing. Like, but you did have a part to play, so
Sure.
you did say yes. You did go through.
But they are not to celebrate Mass.
No,
they are
yeah.
not to hear confessions. They are not to dress in clerical garb.
So that
they are not to present themselves as a priest. And the diocese has a responsibility also to let that be known to priests and the people of God.
That makes sense.
That this person is no longer a priest in good standing, or this priest has been laicized. I know that most dioceses do that when someone's been criminally charged. Like, hey, look what we've done.
Yeah.
He's no longer a priest. That we've done our part, sort of thing. But when a priest slips away quietly, it's not always the case.
No,
that they let it know.
A lot of times you don't actually find out, because I even know priests that have left the priesthood and stuff, and I didn't know that they were priests that have been left.
Right.
And I might have seen them and talked to them and everything else, and they don't tell me and not that they have to unless they're performing some sort of sacramental whatever. But like seeing them in a grocery store or something, you talk to them, and you go like, oh, and then I find out later that they've left the priesthood. Like, oh, I think I should have. Again, if they're not performing priestly duties or misrepresenting themselves, I can imagine they would get really long if I was to reach out and say, hey, Father, and then they turn around because they were used to that, and they can't say, oh no, I'm Mr. now. Like, that would get really old fast.
Yeah, and
now there is emergency cases though, isn't there?
yes, there is emergency cases.
I did see that somewhere.
In the event of an emergency.
So like,
and
we're on a plane, the plane's starting to go down.
And let me be clear about this. Only in the event of an emergency, because I've recently dealt with a former priest who was trying to administer the sacrament of the sick to someone when it wasn't in an emergency.
Yeah.
And there were other validly ordained and priests in good standing available. And their excuse was, well, they were a former priest and they could do this, right? That is not the case at all.
No.
It is only in the event of an emergency, and no other validly ordained priest in good standing is available in short time. Like your example,
we're going down on a plane. We're going down on a plane.
You're going down on a plane, and
can
and
I
you want to
receive the last
offer-
sacrament of confession?
Or at the scene of an accident, let's say
Okay, and the
someone's
person's passing.
dying on the road or something like that.
You can hear their confession. So a laicized priest can still hear confession. Like you said, emergency only, time of death,
It's a hearing of the
on the side of a highway, that kind of thing. But they could hear confession at that time. It would still be considered valid.
Right.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So that's, it's good to know. I mean, if you're going to go on a trip and you're really scared
Bring a
of
former priest.
bring a former
because current priests have no time to go on a trip. Bring a former priest with you. But what I like preparing for this episode, what I didn't know is some of the obligations that the Vatican sets out for people who are former priests. Like, they prohibit certain things that you can do after you're done, and some of them are to have any liturgical role, so you can't preach.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right? You can't preach.
But what about
you
reading?
can't have any pastoral office. So,
makes sense.
let's say you're hired by a
Youth
church to
pastor.
be a pastoral minister, youth minister, maybe the diocese evangelization director
Yeah.
or whatever like that. You can't take on the office of a rector. You can't be like of a seminary.
Yeah, okay, that makes
You
sense.
can't be a spiritual director. You can't teach in seminaries, and you can't be on faculties of theology.
Well, you've given those up when you've left, like if you voluntarily left. Right?
And this is what's surprised me. You can't hold the office of a director in a Catholic school or the duty of a teacher of religion in any school,
Oh, wow.
whether Catholic or not.
Oh, that's a big one because I actually.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what the
I have to talk to some people now.
that's what the Sacred Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith lays out as some prohibitions for someone after they're ordained. Now, the bishop does have a responsibility that he, in his prudence, in his good judgment, could sort of waive those things.
Yeah.
Provided that there's no fear or anticipation of scandal that's going to happen. And you know what? I'm okay with it just because when someone has heard your confession, you know, when someone has been there at a time in your life where you needed a priest, you don't want to confuse people by just putting them in this role of a religion teacher, and now it's like, oh, that guy used to hear my confession, or whatever it might be, right? And I would say, actually, I would add to that, like, even though you are laicized, you still have to hold the seal of confession.
Oh, 100%.
Like, you can't say, you know, I'm not a priest anymore, so Matt, you know,
No.
swore one time or whatever like that.
To be in, because even if I was, get me wrong here, but correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry, if I was to overhear, let's say you and Matt Matt was receiving confession, going to confession around the corner. It happened not to be a private place for whatever reason, and I walked around and I heard some things.
Right.
As a Catholic, I'm still bound by that seal of confession. Right?
That's right.
Right, of reconciliation.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a priest or not, you're still bound by that.
Yeah,
so you, even if you were laicized, you would still be bound by that same seal of confession.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? Makes sense?
So that's basically sort of the...
Let's wrap it up then. So you can be laicized either voluntary or involuntary. You can choose to. You can make your petition as to why.
imposed on you.
Or you can be imposed because of criminal crimes, or like you said, it could be mental illness or something else coming down the line.
And when that happens, you cannot act in any way at all that resembles a priest.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though, like, you know, the criticism of, well, they're still a priest. Yes, at the end of the day, you can't take the priesthood away, just like you can't take baptism away from someone.
But the church can take the authority away.
You have no right to present yourself as a priest, act like a priest, perform any duties of a priest, anything, you know.
Except in the case of emergency where someone's dying on the side of the road by the highway.
And only in the event of a serious emergency where no other priest is nearby or can
available
get there
in time. Yeah. So that makes it kind of summed up. So a priest becomes a regular human. I mean, a laity becomes laicized, becomes laity, and can only and even more so actually, because I could still become a religion teacher or I could become a director of education. They got even further imposed on top of their, so as again not to misconstrue what their position was.
And I would say that there's also a reasonable human expectation that they would be respectful of their previous role.
For sure.
They wouldn't go and sour the name of other priests or other people in the church or the church itself or the bishop, and they would live a life like they've called their former parishioners to do. That it's
they're still Catholic. Well. They're still in the church. They're still there.
So thanks for this conversation. Hopefully it was helpful for people. If you have any follow-up questions for us, you can send us an email at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com or leave a comment or a question on our Facebook or Instagram pages. Okay. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele, and we'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.